Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. We're delighted to have with us today the Cathaoirleach of both Meath County Council and Trim Town Council. And I now call on the Cathaoirleach of Trim Town Council, James O'Shea, to welcome President Higgins and his wife Sabina to the town.
Uachtar an Éireann, President and Mrs. Higgins, Cathaoirleach, Meath County Council, councillors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. As Cathaoirleach of Trim Town Council, it is a great honour to welcome the President and his wife. Trim's motto is always welcome the stranger, but today we welcome a friend. Trim has a great many strings to its bow. It is a town of many festivals. As we bring the curtain down on one of our best, the Swift Satire Festival, now in its 6th year, it has done us proud again. Indeed, Swift is one of the people who made this town what it is today. After he was appointed rector of nearby Larracar, where he held his residence for 40 years. He first stayed at a boarding house in Trim and then became a householder here when he bought St. Mary's Abbey from his good friend Esther Johnson. Swift saw Trim as a refuge from the mad world of politics and religion that existed in Trim and London, and he developed a garden and a walk at Larracar. He was a member of the smaller Christian community, and it is fitting today that in a modern republic we remember all our heroes regardless of what community they sprang from. I'm told Dean Swift described Trim as a dirty town. Well, he couldn't say that now. Trim is one of the cleanest in Ireland, and thanks to our award-winning Tidy Towns Committee. But his name remains synonymous with Trim, especially thanks to the Swift Satire Festival. So on behalf of our townspeople, I would like to thank the organiser committee, Barbara Nestor, Loretta Guinan, and Noel Dempsey. And we have other claims to fame. President Higgins today unveils a plaque commemorating the multi-Oscar winning film Braveheart, which was shot at our castle and its surrounds. His foresight in reviving the Irish Film Board brought Hollywood to Trim and is greatly appreciated throughout County Meath. In more recent years, the Black Friary Community Archaeology Project has again put our town on the map. Young people from all over the world are unearthing artefacts dating back to 1263, and their work has led to the National Geographic recommending that is one of the 10 best places in the world to bring our children. Trim is a beautiful, historical, rich town, and its potential is unlocked by our people. This is exemplified by the community spirit that has given us such success with our Meals on Wheels, our St. Vincent de Paul, our River Rescue. We have more than community spirit. We have hard working too. We need to look no further than our wide range of performing arts, our sports clubs, and the team behind the Skurlockstown Olympiad, who are also working at a new folk park in the town. In closing, I'd like to thank Meath County Council and Trim Town Council officials, their staff, Jackie Maguire, Des Foley, Fiona Skehan, Tony Conlon. I also thank my fellow councillors for their work over the years, particularly now with the passing of the town councils up and down the land. And finally, a personal thanks to local historian and President of the Chamber of Commerce, Noel French. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, James. And now, on behalf of Swift Satire Festival, Trim, it gives me great pleasure to invite President Higgins to deliver the inaugural Swift lecture.
Cohirligan kundas, cohirligan walia, is a guinea core, and gedal shes is minlam a weakest quola sactum, firkin fortune dar shivre mahanes, rivma van kele, sarvin. To asarum vetrim is quivenlam, come on. Ne, lehentin of an scan on brief after shul is neurovegan amshin, vi mehin is nalagadimshiki gavas and Ryan Kene. Har ein redelia mullum gomor and made it up when shamak agli marbalias mar kuluder. I'm very so happy to be here and thank you very much for the invitation, the very warm welcome, all of you. And as well as that, I'm so pleased to hear of the improvements that are being made in Trim on a continual basis, and also on Foigwilsham Morala Gasarvalia. There are just reasons why you would be proud of all of the achievements. It's so proper that they be recognized, the people who work for others and who work to turn the community that you share into the better place that it is. So I join with the chairman in paying tribute to all of those people who achieve all of this. And indeed, I so well recall, as I've just said, in its day, Braveheart was one of the biggest budget films at the time available. It'll give an example of how a small number of people can win a great contract. There were only 4 people working in my department in the film section at that particular time, and we managed to secure that. And really, as I've said outside in the street, I certified films between Braveheart and Saving Private Ryan was the last. And the good news is that every one of those who worked on those films, and I've met them since, I met Mel Gibson a few months ago, and they all say that they would come back. It was also in relation to these days when people talk about transparency. Braveheart was one of those films where at the end of it all, and come the revenue commissioners would be very happy, Mel Gibson arrived in Mespil Road with a big bundle of receipts, and every single penny was accounted for, including a cheque for £1 million to one of the hotel groups in Dublin at that time. And so it was a great success. But he always said to me, as well as that, both in terms of the shooting at night in particular, the cooperation of the people of Trim, daytime and nighttime, was extraordinary. And you were one of the reasons, really, why people would come back again and again. Now it's thankfully, film industry is thriving, and there are a number of skills that weren't there, gaps that we filled, and I so wish it well. So thank you for the welcome. I've decided to give, as the title to this inaugural Swift lecture, Dean Jonathan Swift, of savage indignation, contradictions, and vulnerabilities, and a lesson for our times. And I'm really pleased to give this lecture. And the other thing, I'm sorry that I wasn't here for the reading of my former students, Julian Goff's reading last night, which I'm an admirer of Julian Goff's work. I think he's one of the most original people writing. Anyway, Dean Jonathan Swift, of savage indignation, contradictions and vulnerabilities, and a lesson for our times. It was Einstein who wrote, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift." I thought of this important insight of one of the greatest philosophical scientists when I received the invitation to give the inaugural Swift lecture. Dean Jonathan Swift is one of the clearest examples of a writer whose total trust having been placed in rationality was to see it become the scourge of his life, both in terms of its betrayal as a personal fate and its impossibility of achievement. Swift's life reveals a rage at the betrayal of rationality, not only in terms of it being insufficient as a strategy for life, but also as the source of terror it constituted when distorted or unfulfilled, when what was indefensible was sometimes presented as not merely rational, but inevitable. The word that occurs in those letters of Swift, from the very beginnings, from the time he was at Lara Corps, is the word vexatious. And one might say that his relationship with matters rational was one that left him, as one writer has put it, with a certain ethical impoverishment, but even if it constituted a literary excellence in terms of method. It is remarkable, of course, and thought-provoking, that a figure who came to prominence about 300 years ago should continue to exercise such fascination and admiration. This reflects, of course, not only his literary output, and, for example, his work on the Gulliver's Travels remains one of the great works of world literature, translated into all of the languages and popular with several generations. It reflects not only, however, his literary output, which, as I've said, was substantial and influential. It also reflects the romance and the vulnerability and the contradictions of the man himself in his personal life, and including the enigma of his relationship with Stella and Vanessa. In Swift's case, the audacious courage of the intellect in engaging with the issues he has chosen is delivered again and again with an acerbic genius. It is very interesting, I think he writes late in life when he said, "My purpose is to vex, not to divert." Yet the person who is writing these blistering treatises is a very disconsolate person, a person of immense contradictions, the possessor of a powerful imagination, and yet emotionally stunted. From the biographies of Swift, I think there is a longing and a deep incapacity for the necessary comfort and consolation of intimacy. It is as if the instrumentality of reason had overwhelmed those instincts of the heart so necessary for survival, those instincts that are necessary to provide the softnesses to enable a life of contradictions to be endured. It is on the intuitive mind, in Einstein's sense, that one relies when reason is insufficient or is betrayed. It is in that space that one can not only recognize the contradictions with safety, but also one can attempt to transcend them, wait for new challenges to arrive, or construct out of the imagination such a range of possibilities as might make a utopian alternative. The circumstances of Jonathan Swift's life show how his several beginnings, his many reactions, his attempts at utopia are regularly frustrated. And that which might have been a utopia is rendered dystopic. That is, for example, the rejection by his contemporaries of the reasonableness of his analysis is regularly thrown back in his face. And as a result, he is, while ferocious with his pen, timid in spirit, as one writer put it, he is driven to reach for satire as his main weapon. In doing so, Jonathan Swift was making use of a device that was well known to the Gaelic poets, whose work with which he was familiar. The enormous body of political writing for which he's responsible is mostly following their device to from behind a mask. He's probably then among the first, if not the first, Anglo-Irish writer to see the opportunity of posing the truth to one's times from behind such a protective space when the consequences of a public dissent were dire. It is behind the mask that truth can live and flourish, where irony in the Irish language or in English could be given full expression. So given our present circumstances then, in 2013, it is surely an appropriate time to reach back and allow the invocation of Dean Jonathan Swift to remind us of the importance not only of critical thought in the wake of failed orthodoxies, but to celebrate the value of the dissident mind in all its vulnerability and its capacity for hurt. And that is what is in Swift, is a great disconsolate intelligence. The discrediting of what was claimed to be not only rational, but inevitable into dust in recent decades in terms of its economic assumptions, stated and unstated, the failure of an ideology that offered the Western world a single paradigm of the relationship of finance, economy, and society, its exposure as correctly as a house of cards makes it a very appropriate time for recalling the life and work of Dean Jonathan Swift. For his work is, above all, and most apt for our times, when we are left with the nightmare of a ritualistic irrationality, a structure of thought of little value in facing our problems, one that threatens to quench originality and creativity, that stands in the way of the scholarship we need to design and manage the change we are undergoing. Swift's great disappointment in his time is paralleled today in the hopelessness of so many of our contemporary citizens who had placed their trust in institutions and in representatives that failed them. So we claim Jonathan Swift for ourselves as Irish because matters Irish occupy the greater space in not only his more than 70 tracts, but also in what many regard as his greatest work, Gulliver's Travels. The first 3 books of which deal with local and practical concerns, book 4 being written before book 3. It is in book 4, however, that Swift deals with human nature, making his case that it is less proper to refer to the human being as rational, but rather, one should say, capable of being rational, rationis capax. This, needless to say, drew a response of the greatest outrage, seeming to reject the dominant view then thought that the greatest distinction between the human and the other animals was rationality. And in time, the reaction, for example, of the Earl of Orrery was negative to Book 4, which was a bestseller in 1726. So also, of course, a century later, was the reaction of Thackeray and others. But it is interesting to think as to why, if you like, that reading classes would react. For example, his descriptions of the gentry of the day. In part 4 of the voyage of Gulliver's Travels, in book 4, there is this passage, for example. One day my master, having heard me mention the nobility of my country, was pleased to make me a compliment which I could not pretend to deserve, that he was sure I must have been born of some noble family, because I far exceeded in shape, colour, and cleanliness all the yahoos of his nation, although I seemed to fail in strength and agility, which must be imputed to my different way of living from those other brutes. And besides, I was not only endowed with the faculty of speech, but likewise with some rudiments of reason, to a degree that with all his acquaintances I passed for a prodigy. He made me observe that among the whinyams, the white and sorrel and the iron grey were not so exactly shaped as the bay. You remember, he is among the horses whom he admired and whom he had valued, nor born with equal talents of mind, or a capacity to improve them, and therefore continued always in the condition of servants without ever aspiring to match out of their own race, which in that country would be reckoned monstrous and unnatural. I made his honour my most humble acknowledgments for the good opinion he was pleased to conceive of me, but I assured him at the same time that my birth was of the lower sort, having been born of plain, honest parents who were just able to give me a tolerable education. That nobility among us was altogether a different thing from the idea he had of it, that our young noblemen are bred from their childhood in idleness and laziness, that as soon as years will permit, they consume their vigour and contract odious diseases among lewd females, and when their fortunes are almost ruined, they marry some woman of mean birth, disagreeable person, and unsound constitution, merely for the sake of money, whom they hate and despise. Then the productions of such marriages are generally scrofulous, rickety, or deformed children, by which means that family seldom continues above 3 generations, unless the wife takes care to provide a healthy father among her neighbours or domestics in order to improve and continue the breed. That a weak, diseased body, a meagre countenance, and sallow complexion are the new marks of noble blood, and a healthy, robust appearance is so disgraceful in a man of quality that the world concludes his real father to have been a groom or a coachman. The imperfections of his mind run parallel with those of his body, being a composition of spleen, dullness, ignorance, caprice, sensuality, and pride. So you can understand why there would be a reaction of a certain kind in relation to this. But we do claim, I think it is this, it is in Book 4 that Swift deals with human nature, making his case, as I have said, that it was more proper to refer to the human being as rationis capax, capable of being rational rather than of being rational. In 1946, George Orwell referred to this book, Gulliver's Travels, as one of 6 that he felt should last forever as being a part of world literature. But first, a brief reflection on the man who is remembered indeed as the Dean. Opening his chapter on Jonathan Swift in Irish Classics, Declan Kybert wrote, "Jonathan Swift was nothing if not conflicted. Born in the parish of St. Werburgh's, Dublin in 1667, he liked to pretend that he was really an Englishman, stolen from his country of origin as an infant and brought over in a bandbox. The truth was only a little more mundane. His father died before he was born, and the family went back to England, but an Irish nursemaid who loved the child brought him home with her to Cork when he was just a year old. Even in his cradle, he was marked out for spiritual hyphenation, and in the years of his greatest power and influence in England, he was invariably treated as an Irishman in England, an Englishman in Ireland. He never saw himself in any sense, however, as a revolutionary defender of rights. In his adult life, he did not embrace the cause of 4/5 of the population in Ireland who were indeed denied their rights as Catholics and who were suffering under the penal laws. It would be fair to say that he begins with seeing the circumstances of the Ireland of his time as a place of the inefficient and incomplete project of empire. While he acknowledges the misery of this population of Catholics, he is content to describe it as backwardness and to attribute it to their denominational adherence. He certainly does not see Irish Catholics as victims of imperialism or domination. He is conflicted psychologically insofar as he is forced to locate in Ireland, while London has been for so long, as it was for so many of his education and background, the seat of preference and ambition. His personal story of ambitions thwarted and frustrated is combined, of course, with his courageous championing of controversial and unpopular positions, with all the risks that this ensued. I have referred already to the importance of being able to write behind a mask, as it were. But this made his deanery of St. Patrick's, for example, into a platform to influence the thinking of an age. That influence came to inform what has been called the phenomenon of the aristocratic radical, which has a place in Irish history. His purpose, as even the pulpit was, as he put it, as I've referred already, to vex, not divert his public. While perhaps his most famous work, then Gulliver's Travels, has been transformed into a staple of children's literature, its treatment of the futility of war, its satirical and imaginative power, its recognition of the importance of ethics and the ethical difference in the values and assumptions of the communities, is a universal message that continues to impress and inspire in any arena where there is a contest of ideas and ideologies. And is there not in this great work too an attempt to envisage, describe and yearn in his better moments for an ethical community? It would be very unfair to see in it any simple misanthropy. One can understand, for example, the reaction to of the readers that were drawn from the nobility that I have already quoted. While desperately seeking to discard his Yahoo identity, Gulliver, as he moves from book 3 to book 4, become a member, as is of the Whinyams, the horse community. Gulliver seeks to assume the persona, as I said, of a horse. However, he not only fails in that transition, but the book reveals that the Whinyams as a people fail in their excessive obsession of the rational to the exclusion of softer feelings. There is a powerful parallel between their position of impotence in the face of necessary change and that of a public in the Western world of today, in the grip of the suggested rationality of markets, for example, over which they have no control. It's a remarkable parallel. We can do nothing but suffer on in our false rationality. The literary achievement, of course, of Gulliver's Travels is immense. Edward Said has noted that one of Jonathan Swift's greatest achievements was his ability to balance a commitment to style with the incorporation of the several different voices that were necessary for the populations of the different territories with which the books of Gulliver's Travels deals. It would have been an achievement to have taken a voice, but there, as in fact Said, in analysing the literature, in fact suggests that there has always this struggle between the style that one has established and one's impulse in the writing in terms of theme. But it's the distinction of Jonathan Swift is that as Gulliver moves from one nationality to another and one nation to another in the books, that he's in fact able to achieve a different voice. But the price paid for that style is very high in the decades that followed Gulliver's Travels of 1726. The conflicted persona of the Anglo-Irish writer, who, despairing of one system as to its ethical direction, is about to be disappointed again on the altar of rationality, is surely reflected in the transition from Book 3 to Book 4 of Gulliver's Travels, in Gulliver's leaving of the land of the Yahoos and his arrival with hope in the land of the rational Whinyams. There is inescapably the sadness of envisioned utopias that are turning into dystopias of insufficiency and delusion. As to Jonathan Swift's other writing, there's no mistaking the force and intent of the disturbing challenge of a modest proposal, nor is there any scope for doubting the zeal, energy, and industry of the author of more than the 70 pamphlets that I've referred to, that address in a robust and highly engaged fashion the great issues of his day. What truly endures above all else is the courage manifested in breaking silence in the service of a great, even if incoherent, moral purpose. The righteous indignation is an instrument aimed at exposing a devious, hidden intent, false language, hypocrisy, and what was simply venal. It is for his work then behind the mask, for example in Drapier's Letters, that Jonathan Swift achieved notoriety in his own time. And it is of great interest that in a land known for informers, that he was not betrayed by any of the craft workers in Dublin who were aware of his identity when, for example, he exposed the speculative venture of an English tradesman named Wood, who in 1724 had won the patent to produce almost £200,000 worth of coins, a quarter of the currency supply for Ireland at the time. The brass halfpence were to be sent in barrels to Ireland, and while the Irish establishment sought to break the patent, it was Swift's words behind the mask of Drapier that addressed the insult that it constituted to Ireland and its people. Indeed, that pamphlet had a subversive intent that he probably didn't intend, insofar as it united the different elements of Irish society. And given the year that was in it and what would take place about a half a century later, one can see the force of that. Drapier also commented on other issues of the day, including the pursuit of fashionable garments, personal adornments and cosmetics from abroad by females in Ireland of the time. Drapier favoured, as Declan Kybert puts it, plain clothes and unfussy learning. He was, after all, a critic of Trinity College and of Oxford. Swift was not alone in his condemnation of the heedless consumption of what he called fripperies. Clothing was a subject of energetic debate in the 18th century, and the craftsmen in Dublin with whom he was familiar often confronted those wearing the embellishments of foreign materials and cosmetics. Sometimes they spat at the wearers of these clothes. In such criticism, Swift was joining in a project that was well underway on the part of the Gaelic poets who had written at length about these affectations. Declan Kybert tells us, such strictures were not peculiar to Swift. Bishop Berkeley asked in The Queerest Weather, an Irish lady set out with French silks and Flanders lace may not be said to consume more beef than 100 of our labouring peasants. So the venom with which Swift wrote of such pampered belles was very detailed. Swift's criticism then should not be taken as any simple misogyny, as some have done, but rather as a critique of an increasing and corrupting consumerism, a phenomenon, of course, that would not confine itself to the 18th century. The fascination with Swift, too, I believe, lies as much in the life of the man as in the significance of his literary output. The contradictions and inconsistencies of Swift in his times are relevant again in our own times to the men and women of today, when so many certainties have been shown to be illusory, or indeed when certainty has been claimed for that which there is incapable of verification or devoid of moral consideration, that which is simply accommodatingly exploitative has been exposed. The importance of open categories of thought, of universities free to undertake such fundamental and emancipatory scholarship as will enable the paradigm shifts we urgently need in intellectual thought, was never more acute in our times, and we can draw on Swift for encouragement for that, draw on Swift's rage as a source of encouragement. Thanks to the scholarship of Swiftians over so many years, we have a keen appreciation now of how such tensions and contradictions inform the life of Swift, and how these contradictions of a moral and public policy kind retain their force into our own times. So, celebrated as a radical and a champion of liberty, we know that Jonathan Swift's radicalism was exercised in the interest of a conservative and Tory view of society and the state. While the public Swift was passionate and eloquent on the cause of the public interest and the threats to it arising from the pursuit of private advantage, we know that much of his life, especially in his early years, was in fact the system devoted to the systematic pursuit of personal advancement. The imperfection of the personal, however, hardly cancels the contribution or the grandeur of the public mind of Swift and its expression. After all, the intensity of the Swiftian belief in the rational required that it be delivered into the machine that was the power structure of his time. While Dean Jonathan Swift may have been one of those of whom Anthony Trollope might write so much later in Barchester Towers, as had been hoping for preferment, nonetheless, his was a searing and powerful intellect engaged with the public world of his times. While a passionate advocate of the constitutional liberty of the Irish nation, Swift championed this project on behalf of the landed members of the established church. He was intolerant of dissenters. More or less, he said, if you are in doubt about your faith, keep it to yourself. And he was somewhat indifferent, as I have said, to the status of the majority of the Catholic population, whose plight he saw, as I've said, earlier as a consequence of their denomination affiliation. Declan Kaiban, in his chapter on Swift in Irish Classic, I think summarises it as follows. He railed against the inefficiency and completeness of the Anglicisation process in Ireland, and having despaired of it, he seems in later years to have sought impatriation among the Irish. His regular journeys between Ireland and London indicate a disconnect with the people he perceived to be pre-rational, and at the same time he held, even if he disapproved, an acute sense of manners, conceit, and calculation, which he perceived as unfortunately necessary to court favour where power lay in London. And as to contradictions in the personal life, the tenderness expressed towards Stella and Vanessa contrasts with the severe and bitter treatment he afforded so often to his contemporaries. Then too, misanthropy, with which he was so often credited from such behaviour in his writings, contrasts as well to the profound philanthropy reflected in his founding and endowment of St. Patrick's Hospital, which was a bold and generous act for which we must be grateful today. A devoted and committed churchman, he was often suspected of being a non-believer, but he was a fierce opponent of modernity and an orthodox interpretation of what he saw. He held an orthodox interpretation of what he saw as revealed religion. Of course, his presence in history is forever intertwined with St. Patrick's Cathedral, and he is there, in their discourse, always referred to as the Dean. But he wrote that he was horribly melancholy while they were installing me as Dean. And for others who were in the congregation in the installation at 1713, there was a matter of concern, as they posted on the cathedral gate a prayer. Look down, St. Patrick, look, we pray, on thine own clock and steeple. Convert thy Dean on this great day, or else God help the people. I think shaped as we all are by the events of childhood and upbringing, Swift reflected all of the strengths, weaknesses, and complexities of an Anglo-Irish identity. Just as in our time identity requires to be generously respected as complex, Swift contributed powerfully to the search for meaning and integrity as he saw it in the construction of such an Irish identity as might honour appropriately an Irishness that used independence in a moral way, even while he stayed aloof from some of the major exclusions affecting some minorities, and as I have said, in a most obvious economic sense, a majority too of poor Catholics. It is an old theme that will continue to recur in succeeding centuries, the difference between separation, or an independence that is a separation within empire, and the vindication of rights, of as might be the common people in a French Republican sense. It is also for what he exposes of himself in his self-awareness, as revealed in his letters, that Swift finds a ready place in contemporary society and contemporary literature. He was acutely concerned as to how he was perceived by his associates and his contemporaries. He was self-conscious regarding his appearance, his physical frailty, his capacity to alienate and disturb others, his vulnerable dependence on patrons and associates, his weakness for polemics and dangerous controversy, the rages that he regularly refers to in the letters, and in later years, the scale and impact of his physical and mental decline. This latter, a scourge we must always remember, of so many fine minds, and for some, the terrible price of an elusive truth pursued too far and into the darkness. Nearly 9 years before he died, he writes, for example, in his letter to Pope, "I now neither read nor write, nor remember nor converse. All I have left is to walk and ride." And he wrote that in 1736. As I've said, there's this full, he dies in 1745. But his disappointments were not only personal, they had a material consequence. His falling out of favour with Queen Anne through his writings meant that what his friends had hoped for him, a lean bishopric or a fat deanery, was not to materialise. This realistic vulnerability acknowledged in himself was accompanied by a deep pessimism about human behaviour, as we can see so readily in the books of Gulliver. He was not such an idealist about social reform or popular progress as would ever lift him beyond constructive pessimism. He believed that people behaved as they did in order to achieve reward and to avoid punishment. Higher motives were questionable and largely absent because, in Swift's eyes, of the power of sin. There are, of course, other and more powerful contradictions in Swift that are greater than that posed by commitment to a religious profession of a formal kind that need not be deeply spiritual. In his case, it is rather religious adherence rather than spiritual conviction or elevation. There was a restless sense of endless beginnings, fated to come to naught. This disillusion and despair is sourced in a deep and debilitating disappointment with reason itself, with the futility that flows from the unavoidable conclusion that wisdom comes too late in old age when all the energy of youth is spent, a theme that would be taken up by Yeats and T.S. Eliot and so many others. This contradiction of the human contradiction may be its fundamental contradiction and the source of cultural explanation, of being endowed with infinite imagination but cursed with a finite life, and an unavoidable aging process with its loss of energy, and above all, in Yeats's case, its productive powers, was a concern for many, many writers. It would become a near constant in late 19th century poetry. In succeeding times, it is not that such an emphasis has disappeared, but really as a poetic trope, but rather that it is better evaded or hidden. In Swift's view, society needed a strong state, and the state needed a strong church to regulate or indeed control human behavior, both through external constraints and the inculcation of appropriate internal restraint. The price paid by such a great intellect for such a hard and repressive view was immense. even if adherence to it did yield the materials of the letters and the later scholarship. Beneath that Augustinian pessimism, Swift's determination to be active and to seek to defend, improve, and provoke, and to do such as be such a public figure is impressive, deploying as he did the full power of language, something that is as rare in our times as was necessary in his, and is now in our contemporary culture and society. Swift had no doubt about the power of language appropriately deployed. He relished his capacity to ensure, as he put it himself, each line shall stab, shall blast, like daggers and like fire. He deployed that power with energy, but also with the force and illumination of a powerful creative imagination. He experimented with new literary forms, deploying satire with great effect. He achieved this, in the view of Edward Said, whom I've quoted already, through his capacity to inhabit the views and perspective of those he opposed, his capacity to deploy and extend the arguments and perspectives which he opposed to the point of absurdity, enabled him to undermine and defeat them by exposing their internal logic and revealing their potential for abuse. And through such satiric aesthetics, he pointed the way for others who would in later centuries use the power of language and ridicule to counter oppressive domination. And I repeat again, it is something that was already there in the Gaelic poetry that precedes Swift. But Swift, however, had too good an insight into human nature to believe that this power was anything other than a limited instrument. While satire and the deployment of irony could mobilize and inspire, he was realistic about its limited capacity to convert. He wrote, "Satire is a sort of glass wherein the holders do generally discern everybody's face but their own." Can there be any doubt but that irony and satire remain powerful if neglected instruments in public discourse in our contemporary society? After all, there is so much more material which invites such treatment. In our own time, as I've said, we've seen the power of satire. It can indeed be applied to the pursuit of liberty and the overthrow of tyrants and oppressors. The voice of Swift can be heard echoing in the midst of those efforts and at the very source of very many creative challenges. Yet Swift concluded in his writings that it is in the evidence of his life, and it is the evidence of his life, that more than irony was required. The price of omitting the next step towards a more engaged and public confrontation of structures was to be high in his life. The power of words was the power he used, a power recognized in Swift's writings by later public men such as Václav Havel and one of Swift's greatest admirers, Michael Foot. So in reflecting on the appeal of Swift in our time, it is perhaps then appropriate to remind ourselves again of yet another contemporary parallel. After all, that one of the most significant examples of Swift's engagement in public controversy was in relation to the currency and monetary policy which he saw as being imposed in Ireland. And while he observed that he would avoid engaging with men of the law as readily as he would avoid disputing with a highwayman with a pistol or a troop of dragoons who came in to plunder his house, he did not shirk from the issue. In his time, was a conviction as to duty, rather similar to that of Jürgen Habermas's notion of deliberative democracy in the European Union of today. I think he is closer to that than he is, for example, to the revolutionary thought of someone like Slavoj Žižek writing about Europe. The suggestion is that citizens can only be asked to feel bound by those decisions in which they've been free and afforded the opportunity to participate. So one wonders, maybe yearns for such a pamphlet as he would write now on the dominant controversies of contemporary Europe, Ireland, or the world, or the priority taken by issues of currency over either the common decencies of citizenship or the greater vision of a Europe not only at peace but secure and prosperous for all of its people. It is that power of language and literature to inspire and challenge, which I believe is the most powerful aspect of Swift's legacy for us today. It matters little that the issues which inspired Swift and the causes which he championed in his day are at a distance from our own experiences, challenges, or sympathies. It is Dean Jonathan Swift's passion, his method, and the exemplary power of his imagination which rings true across the centuries. Each generation up to our own may have sought to appropriate Swift's creative effort and apply it to its own reality, not mattering to take into consideration that Swift himself would in his intentionality have been bemused, if not outraged, by some of the causes to which that legacy was put. After all, neither moral indignation nor outrage is selective as to utterance, and it is the moral intention that precedes such an utterance that surely defines its utility. Swift himself said, "What I did for this country was from perfect hatred of tyranny and oppression." Our understanding of the definition of this country and our experience of tyranny and oppression may be far removed from Swift's own experience, but it is the engagement, the determination, the power of language which inspire. With Hazlitt, we can feel little disturbance at his political sentiments, which died with him, considering how much else he has left behind him of a more solid and imperishable nature. It is in the end the witness given to the possibilities of the future, the inadequacies of the present, as yet unrealized, the future as yet unrealized, that obdures. And it is that witness that matters rather than any words that might even reveal the threatening hopelessness or the vulnerability of present experience. And surely it is to that part of the imagination that gives a moral purpose to the engagement of intellect, to the power of language, and to the impact of ideas, that each generation must look with all the available tools of memory and imagination for the resolution of its crisis. Of course, we must have the instruments of good analysis and the sustained application of well-honed expertise. Of course, we must have institutions which are well-designed and fit for purpose. Of course, we must have laws and regulations which are effective in providing confidence about conduct, both public and private. But it is by the quality of the vision, however, that we are tested. The assumptions having been truthfully stated, the end purpose to which an invitation is made clearly declared, allowance must also be made for such a rage as a frustrated moral indignation provokes. Without the engagement and passion of people, without the raised voice of the intellectual and the poet, without the willingness to engage in public discourse at the price of personal risk, without the willingness of the powerful and the well-connected to feel such a thorn or scruple as will impel them to disturb the composure of their class and peers and go on to champion the cause of the marginalized and the excluded, we will not have a society which is worthy of the support and allegiance of all the citizens. There are so many places in our world where a story unfolds of the importance of such a vision, but also too of the fruits of courage and creative imagination in sustaining people in times of trial, and especially in times of defeat, and when despair in the face of tyranny might have been so tempting and was rejected. The willingness and the capacity to speak out in words and in such forms that touch the imagination and fire the spirit is vital, not only in keeping the spark of freedom burning, but in appointing the possibilities of a transforming humanity to emerge. So it does matter for us to know and to celebrate the story of vulnerable Swift's public engagement with his times, and to recall how, in the words of his friend Pope, who died 2 years before him, the rights a court attacked, a poet saved. Abstracted from the detail of the events and causes of his day, it is the spirit of Swift, of whom it was said, "Fair liberty was all his cry," that we celebrate today. And I conclude with a humble suggestion. It is that we must always bear in mind that none of those we admire in history are flawless. As Dylan Thomas, as the Reverend Eli Jenkins in Undermilk would say, "We are not wholly bad or good, who live our lives under Milkwood, and thou I know will be the first to see our best side, not our worst. Only the manner and the time of the revealing of those flaws are variable, and it is all the more right to celebrate those who had courage as well as their vulnerability, to respect their legacy all the more in the light of our appreciation of the flaws within ours and theirs humanity. We know enough now about Swift to recognize the man of flesh could be a trial when provoked under provocation too, but the man and the enduring of his work is truly to be celebrated. And in honoring the voice, works, and life of Jonathan Swift, let us honor the voice of all the writers and the poets and the dramatists who often alone and under pressure have had the courage, still keep the courage to nurture and inspire the human spirit. Thank you.
Gorif Mila Mahagat Uachtaráin. And as we expected, you certainly set the standard for others to follow in the coming years. And now I'd like to present you and your wife Sabina with some gifts, and I would ask Paddy and Sharon to come forward. And Sabina, if you would come up here, please. And these have, I think there's some books with a County Meath flavour, and both fiction and non-fiction, I believe. And all, I think they're all inspired by initiatives emanating from Meath County Council. So now it remains for us to conclude the festival, and I'm going to call now on our festival patron, Noel Dempsey, to do just that. Noel.
Uachtaráin a Cathaoirlig agus a Cordélig. Gur míle maith agat Uachtaráin a suchtan óráid sin, óráid samúl. I think Pat is right. This was the inaugural Swift lecture, and I can see us having some difficulty when people read it, volunteering to be the second or the third or subsequent. But it's no surprise to me at either the content or the delivery of that particular lecture, because I've known President Michael D. Higgins for many years, 25 years in the Dáil, and I would have to say that he is probably, during my time, the single best orator in Dáil Éireann, because he always spoke from the heart and with a passion for the subject that he spoke, and I think that was evident again today. I know that as many of you as possible would like to meet or shake the hands of the President and so on, so this isn't a long speech, so if I leave anybody out or anybody feels insulted, I didn't mean to insult any of you. Just to say, on behalf of everybody associated with the festival, a very sincere thank you to our sponsors, and we think we have them posted right around the place for the last 4 or 5 days. This festival would not be possible without the sponsorship that we get from, largely, I have to say, from public bodies, and I want to acknowledge that. Can I thank also the very many people who just help, who are not part of the committee at any stage, but you ask them, will they do something? The various organisations, the drama group, the musical society, the literary clubs and so on, you just ask them and they help us out. So just to acknowledge that as well. And finally, my task as patron is to try and encourage the committee to move from the 6th to the 7th festival, so I want to thank them as well. And again, it's invidious to mention any particular names, but I know the committee will excuse me if I just mention 2 names this year, because they're 2 newcomers to the committee that no tie except maybe attending the festival last year. We looked for volunteers and the 2 of them took on a role that The festival would not have been possible without them, and that's Shane Breslin and Sinead Nivreen down at the back there doing the filming on this. They really were an inspiration to all of the other people on the committee that have been there for 6 or 7 years and who may be getting a little bit tired, so they rejuvenated us. So we say thank you to them. In concluding, I just say I hope we will have a 7th Swift Festival, and we'll certainly work for that. Thank everybody who supported us over the last few days. Gura mille maith.